You were close. Dellagarian. Hi, thank you for the opportunity. I apologize for having to leave prematurely. I was anticipating a shorter hearing, and all of a sudden it was not that short. I'm here because, for the most part, the discussion has been, well, you know, the 86th convention lasted longer than we wanted, cost more than we expected, had some propositions on the ballot that we liked, but it had propositions on the ballot we didn't like. So we shouldn't have another Constitutional Convention for, I don't know, the rest of our lives or what. We decided not to have one in the middle 90s, and that was because after the credit union crisis, the legislature actually passed some stuff because they heard the hoofbeats of the public. And so we didn't have one in the 90s. But then again, we didn't have one in the aughts. What do you call last decade? The aughts? Okay. But I was also involved in the 1973 Constitutional Convention, which by anybody's perspective, conservative, moderate, progressive, was an excellent convention and a very productive convention. It was premised, as you heard Jack Partridge say earlier, because we wanted to get rid of the ban on lotteries, and we also wanted to raise the pay of the legislators because that was fixed in the Constitution at the time. And they had like 3 or 4 things that they said this is what we want the convention to consider, and they wanted it to be a people's convention, so they specifically didn't want legislators to run for the seats to that convention. And for the most part, that's what occurred. A few legislators did, but for the most part, it was non-legislators that were delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And as Jack said, there were 2 from each senatorial seat. At the time, there were 50 senatorial seats, so that was 100. It comprised 100 individuals. They then, once the convention constituted itself, and the idea was the convention was only going to last like about a month. And for the most part, the convention only did last a month. Early on in the convention, because some of us were advocating for some items that were not of those select 3 or 4, the convention asked the then Attorney General, Richard Israel, if the convention could consider things beyond what the legislature told them that they could consider. And Richard Israel's opinion as Attorney General was that, yes, the convention could have a mind of its own. And so the convention did consider other items. And my recollection is that eventually you ended up with 7 items on the ballot for individuals to consider at the November election. And one of them was the raise in pay for the legislators, but some of us were arguing, and had argued like a year or 2 before when we first discovered this to be the case. For me, the revelation was in 1970, I guess, that we had in the state legislature no recorded vote. We had to be one of the absolute very last states in the entire United States to not have recorded vote in the state legislature. It was all in favor aye, all opposed nay, the ayes have it, the motion is carried. Voice votes throughout. The only time we had recorded vote in the state legislature was when it was mandated by the Constitution. You had to have a recorded vote for the budget, and you had to have a recorded vote if you wanted to override the governor's veto, and that was pretty much it. So you might have had like a handful, literally a handful of recorded votes. All the rest were voice votes, not even standing votes. You didn't even know what the count was, let alone who was voting which way. That seemed not the way to go. So my little pet phrase was, if they want to raise in pay, then we should have a raise in performance. And the raise in performance was recorded vote. It was on the ballot in the November 73 list of proposed constitutional amendments, and it was coupled. And that was the whole idea. Not to have them separate, but to have them coupled. The legislators were out there at various cities and towns arguing against it. They were willing to give up their raise in pay because they didn't want to have a recorded vote. The stuff that was most of the other items that were on there passed, like the removing the ban on the lotteries. I think 6-person civil juries as opposed to 12-person juries that you have for criminal cases. I think they wanted to reduce that for civil cases to 6. So that was included and approved. The recurring every 10 years, the voters should have the opportunity to decide whether they want another Constitutional Convention or not. That was included and that was approved. The raise in pay with the recorded vote narrowly did not get approved. In spite of all the efforts of the legislators to have it really trounced, it was almost passed, but not quite. But that was enough to scare the leadership of the House and the Senate. In the 2 months that transpired between November of 73 and January of 74, electronic voting equipment was installed in the state legislature, and we've had recorded vote ever since. The problem is, of course, it's in the rules of the House and Senate. They adopt them every 2 years. They can suspend them anytime they want. It's not a piece of legislation. It's not in the Constitution. It's time for it to be in the Constitution. Most states have it. Well, all the states have it. Most states have it in the Constitution. So this is not cutting edge. That's a good reason to have a constitutional convention, is to get it in the Constitution. Other good reasons to have a constitutional convention. Excuse me. Notice. At the time, I argued that 72 hours notice was really the minimum, because they publish the calendar of what's going to go on in committees. The news outlets are able to report that in the print the next day. People can plan 1 day in advance, and then if they want to, they can actually attend the committee meeting. 48 hours is too narrow, because you don't get that opportunity to plan minimally in advance. Well, none of that is in printed language. It's, again, a rule of the House and Senate, which they can abandon any time they want. And as we all know, they do. Every year at the end of the session, these rules get abandoned, and notice is one of those rules. And the calendar is like this long, and they can consider things anytime they want. This is not the way to run our wonderful state of Rhode Island. These, way back when, in the 70s, things were called sunshine laws. And these sunshine laws need to be in the Constitution, because we don't want them to go away. We all want them to stay. And so that's a good reason to have a constitutional convention. Line item veto. Other states have it. Why can't we? It really troubles me that the concern is that, the Constitutional Convention might get carried away. That's where the fact that it all comes back to the voters comes into play. If you've heard others say, legislation doesn't come back to the voters, but anything that the convention suggests or recommends comes back to the voters. So I would be supportive of a constitutional convention, and to address some of these issues that have been lingering for so many decades now. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Any questions you might have?
Any questions? Mr. Frias.
Just a quick clarification question. Basically, you're talking about sunshine laws from the 1970s and the requirements for notice before a meeting. You are suggesting that we should have a constitutional convention so that we can have in the Constitution a requirement that the General Assembly be subject to its own the open meetings laws, essentially.
The open meeting, open records, campaign finance disclosure, lobby disclosure, all that stuff, basic stuff should be in the Constitution. Okay. I am personally not in favor of cluttering up the Constitution with stuff that really is legislative. But fundamental stuff should be in the Constitution.
Okay.
It certainly shouldn't be just rules of the House and Senate that can be played around with any time they want.
Thank you. Any further questions?